Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, Managing IT in the Hybrid Cloud Era. My name is Christina Lamb from 451 Research, and I'll be your moderator today. Presenting on today's webinar first will be Carl Lehman from 451 Research. Following Carl will be Greg Pierce from Concerto Cloud Service. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. After the two presentations, we'll have a brief Q&A period. To ask a question, click on the question button, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. If not, we'll respond later. Also, the presentation will be made available to all attendees after the presentation is over. Lastly, please provide feedback at the end of the webinar. We greatly appreciate it. And with that, let's get started. Carl, take it away.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you all for joining us today on our presentation entitled Managing IT in the Hybrid Cloud Era. Concerto was kind enough to invite me to speak on the topic today. And to get started, I just thought I'd review some quick agenda items. What I'd like to do is share with you some trends driving change. As you know, many of us in the IT world have been inundated with all types of emerging and new technology to run our businesses, among them clouds. And never in my career, 30 years in IT, have I been struggling to make sense of so many different types of technologies and how they impact IT and business operations in general. So I want to share with you some of the trends that I think are most important to understand that they're driving change. Then I want to jump in and talk a little bit more specifically about what a hybrid cloud is, what it isn't, and what makes it different from traditional ways of performing and executing IT. Then I want to talk about how hybrid cloud affects IT management and tooling. There's a lot of different new approaches that we can take to manage our workloads, manage our applications, manage our infrastructure in the hybrid cloud era. And I'm going to share some perspectives on cloud management and cloud integration. And then I'm going to kind of put that within the framework of a hybrid cloud strategy and architecture, give you a reference architecture within which you can think about how to manage IT, considering all the new and emerging technologies that we have at our disposal, and then summarize with some best practices. So with that, let's move to trends driving IT. First of all, as IT folks, our end users will not care about anything that I say in this presentation. They're interested in things that matter to them. They want it, and they want everything now. They need things that are better, cheaper, and faster. There's nothing new there. That's as old as IT is itself. But what's driving them is their consumer experience. They can get instant gratification from any type of IT retailer or service that they do business with. So why can't my IT organization do the same thing? Plus, some lines of business are struggling with this concept of digital transformation. Digital transformation is being described in some circles as how do I improve the customer experience, the customer journey. So digital transformation means that I have to not only improve the customer journey, my customer's experience, the interactions that the customer does with my firm, but also I have to worry about what my rivals are doing and how they enable unique and improved ways to engage customers, to engage business partners and suppliers. And of course, there's always the poster children that are listed on this slide: Amazon, Salesforce, Uber, Airbnb, etc. Each one of these firms has figured out in their own unique way how to enable digital transformation, how to change the user experience, how to change the value proposition in their market. And they've done so in many cases very disruptively to those enterprises that have long been in their markets. So companies now are trying to figure out, how do I exploit new and emerging technologies, participate in this digital transformation initiative, and give the users what they want when they want it in a better, cheaper, and faster way. And of course, one of the most common technologies that we've implemented in recent years are clouds. And there's various types of clouds, as we all know: software as a service, infrastructure as a service, that enable us to get dynamic access to real-time on-demand access to additional infrastructure when we need it. Platform as a service is a new means to develop applications and test them, and a variety of X as a service. There's analytics as a service, business process management as a service, data as a service. So there's a whole host of cloud services that many enterprises are using and or experimenting with them. The key challenge, though, is how do I integrate them across each other and with my on-premise and existing applications and infrastructure to enable the speed, time to market, and quality that the end users are expecting? So that's one of the fundamental challenges, and this is the type of thing that we're going to be discussing today. So with that, I'd like to go into a little bit about what hybrid cloud is, what it isn't, and what makes it different. First off, hybrid cloud is not co-location with multiple providers. It's not disparate applications running in multiple public clouds or multiple SaaSes by themselves. In these circumstances, the applications don't work together. They don't interoperate. They just function as independent and isolated workloads. And that's fine. What hybrid cloud is, though, in our view, after discussing it with hundreds of users globally, is basically become a services delivery model. It consists of two or more distinct cloud infrastructures or on-premise infrastructure that remain intact, unique, and capable in and of themselves, but they're also coordinated and standardized with various managing technology, control technology, cloud operating systems, cloud management platforms, integration technology, and they interoperate to deliver end-to-end business functions. I want to explain a little bit about an end-to-end business function. So an end-to-end business function, as an example, is something very simple, a procurement process. When you think about a procurement process, it consists of very fundamental steps. Someone requests something, someone buys something from a supplier, someone receives something into inventory and stock, and then someone pays for it. Typically, the procurement process is distributed across 4 types of organizations, may have 4 or more IT systems to execute those individual tasks, and data is either thrown over the wall, passed along in some way through some messaging infrastructure to execute that process. Hopefully, in the end, it all comes together. What was ordered and what was received and what was paid for is all accurate and done so on a timely basis. Well, as we start looking at cloud technology and experimenting with cloud technology, we'll be shifting workloads in different spots. And as we start shifting workloads to different spots, some of those workloads can remain independent. Others will require access to other data in a synchronous fashion. Others may require that process exchange that I just described. So how well a hybrid cloud is structured, how well it's designed to interoperate to deliver end-to-end business functions affects the speed, the time to market, and the quality that users expect. And this is the type of thinking that needs to be maintained when you're architecting hybrid cloud strategy. As you may or may not know, 451 is a research-oriented technology firm. We have a stable of 50,000 IT professionals available to us on a global basis to survey on various topics, and we do so on a quarterly basis. This is a slide that represents one of our recent cloud surveys as to trying to determine what cloud investment is likely to be currently and in the near future. And here we asked an audience of roughly 1,100, which of the following types of cloud services, if any, does your organization currently use, and what will it use in 6 months? And as you can see, we're approaching saturation. Obviously, software as a service is the most popular. On-premise private cloud is something that people are investing in from both a research perspective and an IT budget perspective, migrating from a monolithic infrastructure which is subject to kind of inconsistent and delayed provisioning practices to private cloud architecture, which can be more provisioned a little more quickly than in traditional environments. Infrastructure as a service to burst out, if you will, of existing on-premises resources when needed. hosted private cloud relying on third parties, and platform as a service. So if you take a look at the data that we did historically back several quarters, these numbers have been pushing out to the right rather aggressively, and it's obvious to see that cloud architecture is the direction that IT organizations and enterprises are headed. In fact, when you start looking a little more closely at that, we asked customers, which of the following best describes your organization's which of the following best describes how your organization will use different on-premises, off-premises cloud environments over the next 2 years. A lot of companies say we're going to use single clouds. A lot of companies are going to say multi-clouds. Another 23%, we're going to have multi-clouds with some degree of data exchange and synchronization. And then hybrid cloud is a much more interoperable environment. And then when we ask them what kind of integration execution venues they're integrating, we note that many are moving towards an on-premise private and a hosted private architecture. So cloud architecture, as opposed to traditional, IT monolithic infrastructure, is the preferred means of doing that. Cloud architecture meaning you can dynamically provision and consume a shared pool of resources for compute, storage, and networking. So it's obvious now that virtually all enterprises have shifted their IT infrastructure reliance towards a multi and hybrid cloud architecture, and this gives you a feel for the rate at which it's been transpiring. So what makes hybrid cloud integration different? Well, you have to look at hybrid cloud integration from two perspectives, a tactical and a strategic. The tactical perspective looks at hybrid cloud integration from a data and process flow perspective. How do I exchange and synchronize data, and how do I execute business processes across distributed cloud resources and on-premises resources? The strategic perspective enables you to consume additional resources on demand, almost like cloud bursting. When you need to exploit various execution venues or have access to different execution venues and want to exploit price performance characteristics of different cloud services, a strategic approach is the way to do that, because it needs to include things like economic analysis of different platforms, and then that's tied into a decision model which allows you to say, okay, these are the conditions that we put this workload under what execution venue. The other thing that makes it different from traditional information is that it addresses both application-to-application integration and business-to-business integration. Now, in traditional environments, application-to-application integration, linking apps internally typically, emphasizes how you control logic that flows between applications, how work is performed, how workflow is performed. Business-to-business integration doesn't really deal with logic per se, but emphasizes data standardization and security as purchase orders or invoices execute across a supply chain community, for example. When it comes to hybrid cloud integration, however, it must deal with both. You have to deal with data quality and the ownership of data as it transcends execution venues. Remember, the minute you put a workload into a cloud, you're using someone else's infrastructure and platform that has different behavioral characteristics that are outside of your control. So you have to deal with not only the data and process flows that execute between the cloud service and what other service that you need to link it with, but you also have to make certain that the quality of the data is appropriate, that the control of the data is appropriate, that the business processes execute as needed, that the integrations that were enabled prior to workload transcending to a different execution venue remain intact. And that has to happen without breaking. As workloads shift across different cloud execution venues, you have to make certain that the data is controlled and the process and the integration capabilities are still maintained. And a lot of companies kind of overlook that. And so that requires some forethought. It requires some thinking. And the best way that I have concluded to do that is to consider what I refer to as a hybrid multi-cloud integration reference architecture, which I'll show you in a few slides. But basically, it represents a blueprint of the goals and the practices, the tools and techniques, all the moving parts that you need to manage data and process flows across multiple cloud and on-premise execution venues. And so it acts also as a framework for assembling all the technology and the services that you need to have. When you see this reference architecture in a few slides, you'll notice, hey, there's a lot of stuff here. I have to think about how all of these things work together, and then you have to think about how to simplify that effort as best as possible to perform the IT practices that you need and to enable the business operations that keep you in business. So let's talk about how hybrid cloud affects IT management and tooling. So the challenges that hybrid clouds and multi-clouds pose is challenges of connectivity. How do I connect to them? Scalability. How do I grow and contract so I can take advantage of price performance characteristics of different on-demand resources? Where's my data? Sometimes data gets lost, and knowing where it is and how it's and the type of quality that it affords the enterprise is important. And operational control. A lot of times there is no operational control of cloud services. In fact, it's kind of even getting a little bit more confusing as cloud service providers introduce the concept of serverless computing, which means you just give that cloud service provider your application, and they worry about where it runs and on what infrastructure and what kind of memory, CPU, network, storage is required. So it requires this whole concept of reprovisioning workloads to go distribute across multiple clouds needs a new approach to management and tooling. And so to help think through what that approach is, you have to consider where you are in your use of cloud services. And so typically, companies have engaged in a series of waves of cloud computing. The first wave was on-premises to SaaS. So we all use SaaS services first typically. And the biggest challenge we had to deal with was data loading. And we relied very little on data quality management at the time. We allowed the SaaS provider to manage data quality to some extent once we got the data into the SaaS. The security and was entrusted to SaaS providers, and that was acceptable. That got a lot of line of businesses up and running quickly with a new set of systems and tools that they didn't have before, and that their IT organization couldn't provide them, and hence the growth of SaaS. The second wave occurs as various cloud services accelerate. So as workloads start to shift to more SaaS and to infrastructure as a service for runtime, and then as platform as a service is used for application development and testing, and in even some cases in runtime environments, data quality matters. So it's the challenges of understanding how data is curated, how it's created, how it's managed and deployed becomes a higher priority in distributed cloud operations. And applications and processes need to exchange data. There has to be some forethought as to what apps need what data and to what business process are they participant, so that as you start shifting workloads, you don't break those integrations or those business processes when you take a workload from an on-prem environment and let's say put it into a public cloud, for example. And then later on, there's more strategic initiatives that can create additional challenges as companies pursue big data analysis, various Internet of Things projects, and they start containerizing their applications and using microservices. All of these things represent a whole new way of integration, and they make workloads operate differently. And so forethought needs to be given as to essentially how all of this needs to be done. And the best way to start to do that is to think about, well, what are some of the capabilities, the managerial and control capabilities that you need? That includes things like data preparation and coordination and of collaboration and processes, the integration designs, how to manage data flow and business process orchestration, how to design distributed runtime integrations and how they work across on-premises resources and across various clouds, how to coordinate and administer and report and do troubleshooting of all this, and then basically how is it structured? How is all of these tools structured in a hybrid cloud integration architecture? So with that, I'm going to start giving you some diagrams to kind of help think through this a little bit, and they can be used as tooling to create your own hybrid cloud strategy and your own hybrid cloud architecture. So the first thing is that there's multiple clouds out there that we're all aware of. That blue bar underneath them are the systems of engagement. These are some of the applications that may link to them or we may port to clouds for some reason. And on the back end are various systems of record, the transactional databases, content repositories, big ERP business systems. The DevOps and IT Ops teams are in the process right now of looking for the best execution venue. So they want to take a look. There's a concerted initiative and effort underway in most enterprises right now to do application portfolio rationalization. That means they're looking at all their applications and they're trying to figure out which ones are important, which ones do I need to invest in, which ones cost too much, and what should I do about them. As part of that, they're saying, well, which ones can I put in different workloads? I mean, which workloads can I put on different execution venues? So they're thinking about how to redistribute workloads across multiple execution venues. In the past, all we had was our on-premise system and maybe a managed service or hosting provider. Now we've got on-premise, managed service hosting providers, private cloud, public clouds, infrastructure, software as a service, etc. So we've got a lot more choices. So that means that the workloads are going to shift based on business strategy. Companies are starting to determine policy that says under what conditions do we put what workloads on what execution venues. So the tools to do that are typically found in cloud management platforms. And while this kind of looks busy, this part of the architecture, the reference architecture, shows all of the moving parts of a cloud management platform that allows companies to determine, to control and manage configurations, to manage change management, to manage the cloud services themselves, to include the virtualization as part of a cloud management and a workload redistribution system, etc. So these are all of the detailed moving parts that some cloud management platforms take care of, or some cloud service providers take care of. There's another thing to consider, though, and that's the integration technologies. So while cloud management is important to understand how to shift workloads and maintain them in various execution venues, integration technology also needs to be considered. So companies now are looking at a combination of resources that include enterprise service bus, extract, transform load, IPaaS, integration platform as service, API management as service, and others. They're trying to combine and coalesce all of those capabilities into more uniform platforms to get as much of this functionality from as few vendors as possible. Right now, the integration toolkit of most enterprises is quite large and aging, and so the tool structure required for integration for hybrid cloud architecture is beginning to change and coalesce a bit. And the way it's changing is I put a solid red bar about the pieces where vendors are consolidating things and a dotted dashed bar to show where it's still fragmented. And as you can see, the integration layer for data and process flow is coalescing quite nicely. The vendors that play in this space have got integrated suites that that do a very good job of combining the data and application and process orchestration capabilities in a common and uniform cloud offering. In fact, the IPaaS market, integrated platform as a service market, is kind of poised to take control of this. But what's still very fragmented is the cloud management piece. There's lots of different vendors offering lots of different point and best-in-class solutions, making it very difficult for companies to rely upon or making it very difficult for them to make decisions about how they should do and use this tooling. So there's still a lot of work to be done in that end of the market. And it gets a little bit worse when you start adding to it the development environment. So most companies have engaged in agile development practices and are beginning to push development and operations silos together to enable those teams to work more closely together, and they're building out tools to enable continuous integration and continuous deployment to rapidly bring applications to market. And that gets added to this architecture, to this reference architecture, and this is a diagram that explains all of that level of complexity. And so this diagram represents kind of a mind map, if you will, a reference architecture to allow you to think through all the different things that are needed or may be needed when dealing in a hybrid multi-cloud architecture where workloads are distributed across multiple execution venues, and you've got to figure out where to put them and how to maintain them over time. So let me summarize with a couple of best practices how companies are using this reference architecture. First of all, they're starting with a cloud strategy. They're taking a look, as I mentioned, at all their applications, and they're saying, okay, let's do a rationalization effort. What's important? What's less important? How much budget do we have for all of these apps? What do they cost us? What value do they bring to the company? How do they need to work? And then determine under what conditions do which of these workloads shift to what execution venue and why. So some analysis is required to understand the price performance characteristics of execution venues. Some risk analysis has got to be done in terms of the value afforded the workload, and then tooling needs to be considered to be able to redeploy that workload as determined by policy. The next thing is define a hybrid multi-cloud integration reference architecture of your own to manage integration strategy and use cases and to manage the challenges of hybrid IT, which means to take that diagram that I offered, you don't need all of that stuff on there, but look at it and say, okay, this is what I need, and circle what you need, and then try to find offerings that enable as much of those capabilities that you need from as few service providers or a few vendors as possible. So this reference architecture gives you the mindset, the framework within which to figure out how IT management needs to occur in a hybrid cloud architecture. And then finally, seek platforms that simplify and manage complexity. Simple tooling, enable the hybrid multi-cloud integration, tactical and strategic approaches that I suggested earlier. Having a support for a DevOps strategy is important. The combination of development and operations in many enterprises is accelerating based on a lot of our survey work. These platforms need to address how distributed business processes flow across a hybrid architecture. So tooling to manage and control that as part of the reference architecture is needed. Also extract, intelligence from what we call total data. So now that we've got this architecture and data is distributed across multiple different infrastructures, how do I extract the data that I need for analytics? Well, sometimes that's overlooked, or it's isolated within a specific big data department or data BI or analytics department, but it needs to be looked at from a broader perspective. And supports the needs of different users. It's not just IT, but many companies are trying to expose their data, their workload and applications to line of business in easier ways so they can do their own integration, they can access their own data. The whole concept of citizen integrators and citizen developers and citizen analysts is emerging. These are non-technical folks that need to use these tools and infrastructure. And hybrid multi-cloud integration architecture should be designed to enable that, and also protect current application investments. So when I step back and I look at the complexity of that reference architecture that I put together, which by the way was a culmination of several months' work with multiple vendors and end users that added value to it, I realized there's a lot of moving parts here, and I want to simplify this as best as possible. I would be seeking a service provider or a vendor that knows how to do this stuff, because if I just go to rely upon my cloud provider like AWS or Azure or even IBM or Rackspace, a lot of these folks don't necessarily have the business acumen to be able to help you. They can understand their operating environment and how to make it work, but they don't necessarily know how to make it work for your enterprise. And so I would be seeking companies that had expertise in both those domains. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg.
Carl, thank you. It's some great information. I'd like to start off by giving a little bit of information on Concerto and who we are. Concerto is a cloud provider and is a fully managed cloud provider at that. We work with a range of clouds, including private cloud and public cloud, so that would be AWS, Azure, and Office 365 from a public cloud perspective. But let me take you back a little bit and tell you how we got started. Somewhere right around 2011, so roughly 5 years ago now, we came to an understanding that our customers and partners within the technology ecosystem were really looking for a better way to deliver technology solutions. And at the time, if you recall, cloud was even debated as, is it really something new? Is it something different? Is this the right name for this thing? And this was all so very new to everybody. What we saw at the time was that there was really a need for a mission-critical private cloud type solution, which is what we built, but with an eye towards the future, built a management piece to be able to manage the public cloud infrastructure as we move forward. And I think what you see today is that those sort of solutions dovetail into the hybrid and multi-cloud strategies that Carl brought up earlier, because cloud has become a part of the fabric of IT. And from an IT perspective, if you don't have a proper strategy connected from a cloud standpoint, then I think you're going to end up in a bit of trouble. And part of the reason is this quote, I think, is a great one. It was Jim Fowler, who's the CIO of General Electric, and this was at the Amazon reInvent conference. And he said the cloud has gone from probable to inevitable. And when you think about it, the cloud really is a revolution. And that may sound like a very bold statement, but think about this. The world's largest taxi cab company has no vehicles. The largest media company in the world creates no content. The most valuable retailer in the world has no brick and mortar stores. And the largest hoteler in the world owns no real estate. And we're talking about Uber, Facebook, Alibaba, which, by the way, a lot of people think Amazon in that one, but it's Alibaba, and Airbnb. And think about if you're right now a small software company looking to get going, the things you would have had to have done in the past to get to a point of launch for your company were pretty staggering. You'd have to put in place some IT infrastructure. You'd have to have somebody who had knowledge and understanding of it. And today, there is very low barrier to entry because of cloud and because of the ability to utilize cloud infrastructure to further your business. And this is not only for technology companies. I mean, think about if you wanted to start a company, I don't know, making T-shirts. And the T-shirt company was going to talk about, well, we'll forget about what the T-shirt company is going to talk about. But the T-shirt company is going to sell online and is able to use cloud infrastructure to support the internal business needs. You can literally start up a company with very little capital up front. And I think that is what the revolution's about. It's just driving so much innovation in the entire business industry, and it's making the world smaller and tying companies and people together. And I think part of the reason is hybrid cloud. It just doesn't make sense to move stuff to a data center anymore and do it on premise. And I think what you're seeing these days is an understanding that this multi-cloud strategy makes sense and that hybrid makes sense. But very few people have taken the time to start kind of drawing a line in the sand like Carl did with his architecture this is exactly how you should build it out, and this is what it should look like, or these are the exact things that you should take and move to cloud. And right now there's something in the marketplace called cloud wash, where even the providers or the companies that are presenting the cloud solutions aren't quite sure what they can do yet. This really goes beyond hybrid. It becomes a multi-cloud strategy because there's specific things that make sense to put in public cloud, and then there's others that make sense to go in private cloud. And you've seen some guidance like systems of engagement versus systems of record, which is a Jeffrey Moore thing. Jeffrey Moore believes that systems of engagement should be pleasant and should engage the users, and that is more of a public cloud type deployment. Systems of record have to be accurate, they have to be fast, they have to be secure and compliant, and those make sense more in a private cloud perspective. But those are very general terms. So in a few slides here, I'm going to give you more of a lay of the land of what we think is workload specific as far as where to put in specific clouds. I think it's important to talk about cloud strategies, and Carl talked about it and touched on it earlier. And defining the right strategy is extraordinarily important. And I think that for the last 4 or 5 years, everybody said, you have to have a strategy, you have to have a cloud strategy, you have to have a cloud strategy. Well, guess what? Mostly everybody has a cloud strategy, 76% have a formal cloud strategy, but all of them aren't right. And part of the reason for that is think about just the pace of innovation. It's absolutely dizzying. And in order to create that strategy and be the right kind of advocate / consultant to your organization, you need to be an expert in something that changes at breakneck speed. So think about what we used to have to deal with from a software perspective. If there's a new version of XYZ software coming out, a database software, whatever it happens to be, the roadmap was most likely between 16 and 20 months for every new major release that would come out. Now you're talking about literally 16 to 20 days for new releases. When you're looking for something like, say, serverless deployment of code, it may be available on one cloud provider today, like AWS Lambda, and then 2 weeks from now it may be available on Azure, and Google will have their version of it. And being able to keep up with that and understanding which one makes the most sense for your company and which one makes the most sense to stay away from is extraordinarily difficult. You know, all these changes are hard. So when you try to sit down and determine what that right strategy is going to be, a part of it has to be just dedicating yourself to the cloud and understanding it has become part of the fabric of IT, and that it has to be part of your strategy going forward, and you have to spend time to understand exactly what to put in place. Think about Netflix, which I think is fantastic for consuming movies and being able to get content and so forth. When they first started out, I don't know if anybody remembers, but they struggled with downtime here and there, and they had to innovate and create a separate strategy in order to survive. And what they did was build out what they call a chaos monkey, and it simulated just about every single point of failure and everything that could go wrong within their software. And guess what? It worked, and now they have uptime that is at such a point that nobody ever talks about Netflix in terms of Netflix was down because they changed and they innovated and they found the right mixture of strategy for their company. It's human nature to not want to give up control, and I think a little bit of moving to the cloud is that move of, hey, you know what? I'm going to have to give up a little control. If you don't, what's going to happen is that you're going to end up choosing the wrong cloud strategy. And what that does is it creates a loss of a tremendous amount of internal capital. It's not enough just to assess cloud or say, hey, you know what, we're going to go cloud. You have to lay the groundwork for a great cloud strategy. So how do you choose? Well, I can't sit here and tell every single one of you exactly how to choose. Some of you love the bleeding edge, and you probably know who you are. You have this presentation on your laptop. You have a tablet where you're probably looking at some other work, and your phone's up at the same time as well. And people who are on the bleeding edge, well, they're just going to want to embrace technology, and they're going to adopt the newest stuff. But for other organizations, it's difficult to determine exactly where that right solution is. And it's important to not deal in futures when you're looking at mission-critical applications that can't go down. It has to be something that is in place within that cloud environment, whichever cloud it happens to be. It has a proven track record of working, and it's not going to be something that is the bugs are worked out of over a period of time. So there's a nice blend, I think, of different types of cloud environments to adopt, and I think that also ties very nicely to making sure that the right strategy is adopted to tie to it. And when you think about really how the hybrid cloud matches needs, really it comes down to a few different factors that are pretty easy to define but difficult to meld together. And the amount of time that you're going to be up is extraordinarily important, and that generally correlates to how much money you're going to spend for your particular cloud platform. Also ties to the management of it. If you want to have a uptime that is actually associated with your application, then you're going to have to look at an actually managed platform as opposed to an unmanaged platform. Otherwise, a cloud provider wouldn't be able to give you a very high, say, 4.9 type uptime. What you also need to look at, of course, is cost because it's not immaterial. The right mix from a security perspective of what you can have from a compliance footprint and what kind of security and regulatory you can have in place, the right mix of performance. Some things need to be really, really fast, and some you can trade off a little bit of performance for dollars. How much it needs to be managed and how much investment you need to have in order to be integrated to other platforms, because very few things stand on an island these days. So what you see emerging in the marketplace, it's been around for a little while now, are groups, and generally you'll see them at cloud providers, that will give you advisory services to help your organization understand exactly what the right mix of cloud is, how to deploy it, and how to have that seamless integration. And in the best of all worlds, you're going to have a scenario where not only is it integrated, but you can move them back and forth, and it's very invisible to the end user and is easily transformed by the IT group. So if you start looking at the different types of systems that have uptime requirements, starting with the low to mid nines, you have things that are very non-critical, things that are archive data type scenarios. Generally, backup files are not on systems that have extraordinarily high uptime. Those are the sort of things that are on the lower end of the spectrum from an uptime and nine perspective. When you start getting towards kind of the entry point of more mission-critical type applications, you have systems that are tied to, say, non-critical reporting items that tie to entry-level ERP. Let's face it, if you're just starting a company up, the capital is probably more important to you than a few hours of downtime because you need that capital to grow your business. But as companies transform into larger organizations, that's when you see things change to more of a focus on higher uptime because every little bit of time, whether it's measured in hours or in the case of 4 nines, we're talking about less than an hour on a yearly basis equate to money. And if you are deploying systems that actually tie to your end users, like i.e. e-commerce and companies need to order it, it becomes extraordinarily important to be able to have the right things in place so that you certainly can reach those sort of mission-critical nines from an uptime perspective. And when you think about it, if you're not doing that, and if you don't become the person within your organization that can do it, or if IT doesn't transform into that, then what you see is a lot of organizations, or within organizations, groups moving to more of this shadow IT type scenario where different business units, like let's say marketing, go and procure cloud environments on their own. And they just kind of leave IT out of the middle, and there's no governance to it. And that can be a little bit dangerous because when you think about it, the application has moved beyond the infrastructure conversation. It's much more about the functional and the business need drivers. One of the things we like to add to this criticality chart is cost and then also security and compliance, and we chart it out in a graph format as well. So I think those are really the three major components that you have when you're looking at how your organization is going to look to deploy applications in the cloud. So we've got a couple things here. In a second, we're going to open it to questions. And we have an offer that we wanted to give to the audience today, which is to be able to get a cloud cost comparison. Really, it is a advisory type service to get an idea of which applications should go in which cloud and an idea of what the cost would be for that. And I think that there's an email going around that will give you more details on that offer. So with that, I think we're going to open it to questions.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Our first question is, do you partner with software companies? If so, which ones? And how do you decide what cloud to use, AWS or something else?
So that's probably a deeper question that we could follow up on afterwards. We partner with both Microsoft from an Azure perspective and Amazon from an AWS standpoint. And then, of course, we have our own private cloud, and we use the charts that we put together to help determine which workloads make sense to put in which specific cloud. But really what it comes down to are the critical success factors for the customer, and generally that's going to be security, regulatory compliance, how fast does it need to be, how much does it need to be up, how much does it need to integrate. And if we're working with software companies and some others, a lot of times they would rather have a predictable billing model, i.e. it's a flat rate per month as opposed to consumption-based, so that plays into it as well.
Wonderful. The next question, other than uptime, do you include drills to practice business continuity? What about data durability?
So, I can't speak for other cloud providers, but we certainly do include drills for business continuity and making sure that there are failovers in place that actually work and do that on a regular basis.
And to follow up to that one, as companies start using more cloud services for different applications, how do they approach risk management?
So this is Carl. I can take that one. So as I mentioned earlier, many enterprises are currently engaged in various types of application portfolio rationalization. They're using tools or service providers to help them take an inventory of their applications and then qualify and quantify them in various ways. The most important of which is, what is the value of the application to the enterprise, meaning to what degree does it allow the enterprise to translate its value proposition to a customer, and if it fails, what happens? What is the risk tied to that? So application portfolio rationalization, it takes an inventory of applications and various workloads, assigns a risk assessment value to them, using a tool, potentially an enterprise application, an enterprise architecture management tool, or just some basic discipline that describes the various value of that application or workload to the enterprise, and then begins to build out the performance characteristics needed for that. And to Greg's point earlier, what level of nines is needed for this to be up and running, and assigns that, and then ports those workloads to the execution venues most likely to enable that type of performance characteristic. There are other types of risk. There's security risk, there's compliance risk, there's financial risk, et cetera. So there's different lenses that companies look at. The example that I shared with you is really a value and a performance lens. But depending on the nature of your enterprise, the nature of your industry, the competitive rivalry in your industry, the needs of your customers, and the government regulations you're subject to, you look at those applications through various lenses. The value and uptime risk, the security risk, the performance risk, the financial risk, et cetera, and then prioritize those workloads and put them on the most secure and reliable execution venue as possible.
Okay, we have one more question. Greg, could you please talk about Cisco powered and what that means?
Sure, yeah. So I believe we had that on a slide, and I might have skipped over it. Cisco is a large part of our private cloud infrastructure, and specifically tied to some of the newer technologies in ACI, allow for a very fluid hybrid platform with management tools that allow for easy deployment within public clouds and private clouds, but also the ability to move things very easily and maintain the right governance structure around applications to really mitigate and lower risk. There are, I believe, just a few dozen, and maybe even just a couple dozen Cisco-powered cloud providers in the world, and we're fortunate to be one of those, and have done some very fine things with our friends at Cisco.
Wonderful. And that's all the time we have for questions today. On behalf of today's presenters, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar, and we hope to see you on another webinar soon. Thank you, and have a great day.